Welcome, and thank you for joining us. Like they say on the airplane, you are here for the Convergence Center for Policy Resolutions Reentry Ready report release. My name is Stephanie Magency, and I'm the director of the Reentry Ready project, and we're super excited that you are here this morning. Today is the culmination of about 18 months of effort of a number of individuals who were involved with the project. And my grandmother was a huge influence on me, and she would say that it's always nice to be nice. So we'll start by acknowledging folks who made today possible, if you will indulge me. I'll start with our Reentry Ready stakeholders. If you are looking at the executive summary on the chairs, their names and organizational affiliations are listed in the inside cover, and a few of them are here now. We're expecting a couple more later. So if you wouldn't mind, those of you that are here, stand as I call your name so we can acknowledge you. Darren Svensson from Core Civic is here. Leanne Bursch is here in the front, North Dakota Department of Corrections. Mark Levin from Texas Public Policy Foundation and Right on Crime. A advisor supporter, Carter Stewart from the Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation. And Ashley McSwain from Community Family Life Services. The agenda says American Conservative Union Foundation, but it's Community Family Life Services. A second person I'd like to acknowledge is our CEO, Rob Firsch. He has the vision for what we know as convergence, but also green-lighted this important project. So, Rob. And of course, there is the Reentry Ready team. So Morgan Franklin is the current associate for Reentry Ready. And, And also here is Gabrielle Alessi Friedlander Bowersox, who started this journey with me and I'm happy that you're here today to sort of see how it all wrapped up. So thank you, Gabby. And the last group that I'd like to acknowledge are those funders that invested in us in this process to make what you're going to hear more about today possible. We'd like to thank the Einhorn Family Charitable Trust for their support. And there were other individual donors who are gracious and generous and invested in the Dialogue to Action part of our work and the overall Convergence General Operating Support Fund. So thank you to all of those folks for making this happen. Our tasks today is simple. We have two key goals. One is to share recommendations from the reentry stakeholder table, so give you a peek into what we did for 6 meetings over 18 months. And two, to enlist your support in helping us to share these recommendations with your network and help us to earn traction in the field for the ideas that are presented here. This is just a diagram of our Dialogue Leading to Action approach to give you a sense of the framework behind the intense discussions that we had, again, over 6 meetings for about 18 months. Rob will talk a little bit more about it when he comes up later. Why incarceration and reentry? Incarceration and reentry, like other convergence projects that we've addressed on education, economic mobility, long-term care, and the like, fits the bill and really is a good example of how our process can roll out and is effective, because looking at the scope of the problem, there are lots of people who are affected by incarceration and reentry in our country. There are clear things that can be done to improve outcomes for those who are experiencing the challenge. There are also, in this space around incarceration and reentry, probably the understatement of the day, clear divides that need to be bridged in order to build some consensus solutions. We were fortunate to have 24 of the influencers and change makers in this space sitting at the table with us. But as a part of our process, we also interviewed about 150 influencers and change makers related to incarceration and reentry. All of that put us in a really good spot to have deep discussions and really assess the readiness for transformation in this space. So we brought these folks together, and over 18 months, at the core of it was this question: how do we transform incarceration and reentry systems to help people be more successful when they reintegrate back into society? And you'll hear me say a lot this morning, incarceration and reentry systems, and by that we mean corrections, health, education, labor, housing. Basically everyone has a nickel in the quarter as it relates to reentry success. Who were sitting at the table? All of these systems that are represented in this chart, because like I said, every single one of these systems has a role in improving reentry outcomes. One too many. Our stakeholders developed a couple of things that were key elements of our dialogue process. They created a set of principles and a theory of change, which you'll see in the executive summary document. I can't understate how important those things were to underlying the discussion and being a real guidepost for us as we were thinking about each of the recommendations. I'll stop there because our featured guest is here, but I'd like to invite up now our President and CEO, Rob, to give you a little bit more detail about our process, and he'll introduce our speaker.
Well, good morning, everybody. I, too, want to thank everyone for being here with us today at the important pivot point in this project where we move from dialogue to action. I want to acknowledge Stephanie Magency's outstanding leadership of the project, and Gabby and Morgan for their help day to day. And I, too, want to acknowledge our stakeholders and our speakers here today to try to make sure we give lift to the ideas that are embodied in this report. Some of you may not be familiar with convergence. I'm going to give you 2 minutes about that, and I'm going to then introduce Senator Tim Kaine. In case you don't know about us, we're 10 years old, just turned 10 in April. We were created to fill a gap in Washington, D.C. and around the country whereby people who actually wanted to solve problems but disagreed on how to do so could find a place to talk to each other and potentially find powerful areas of common ground even though they agree to disagree about a lot of items. So what we do is we convene people with the collective knowledge, experience, and influence that if they can reach agreement on ideas, they can move the dial forward. And of course, it has to be on ideas that support some shared purpose. You might even call it a shared moral purpose. But it's always about trying to improve the country in one way or another. Our methodology basically is here, just so you get a sense of it. It's painstaking. It requires a lot of work. We do a lot of research to begin with. We identify an issue where we think the country's divided or the need to have people come together. We do a lot of research to create a map of who thinks what, who should talk to whom, where do the differences lie, where are the areas of potential. We then frame up the issue in a way that's inviting to people of different points of view so they feel like they really want to be at the table. After that, we assemble a table of, we can't have a perfect table, usually somewhere between 20 and 40 people. We assemble them for a structured dialogue of 1.5 to 2 years and have them hammer out, if you will, agreements on different ideas and work through their differences. And more often than not, and I think you'll hear some of this today, people have the veil lifted about the misconceptions they have about each other's views, and they often find that underneath it all they agree a lot more than they thought they do. And then, as today is very much emblematic of, I don't know if that was grammatically correct. We then ask people to form together to take action to move these ideas out into the world. And the people at our table, and you'll hear a lot from a lot of them today, as well as our other guest speakers. I want to warmly welcome our other guest speakers as well, because you will add depth and richness to today's proceedings. We've chosen these people because they have the collective knowledge and influence that they can move the ball forward. So we're very excited to have this day go forward. Just as by way of background, in case you don't know, we do work on multiple issues. In the past, we've had success working on K through 12 education, think teachers unions and charter school networks actually working together on a shared vision, nutrition and wellness, food companies and consumer groups working together to help combat obesity and diabetes. We have had a great project on economic mobility, on long-term care, and on U.S.-Pakistan relations, which is actually where we first met when we brought in a delegation of legislators from Pakistan to meet with American members of Congress. And of course, we also have worked on recently the federal budget process. We have other ongoing policy work going on now on healthcare, both here and in California. And we are now working at their invitation very closely with the House bipartisan working group, a group of 28 members of the House who want to work together to find common ground, and we're helping them. One thing I just want to emphasize for everyone who is here is that we are a policy-neutral organization. Our job is to convene the people who are the leaders and the experts and to be trusted by all that we do not have a stake other than in them being successful. We don't put our fingers on the scale one way or another. We don't even formally endorse our own the recommendations of our group. However, we do stand ready to help them move them forward. So that's who we are. I'm delighted to welcome Senator Tim Kaine today. Senator Kaine was first elected to the Senate in 2012, and he serves on the Armed Services, Budget, Foreign Relations, and Help committees. He was first elected to office in 1994, serving as a city council member, and then mayor of Richmond, and then he became lieutenant governor, and so on. Throughout his time in the Senate, Senator Kaine has advanced the idea that those who have served time and repaid their debt to society should be able to return home and start anew. Last year, he was a supporter of the First Step Act. And he has also advocated fairer hiring practices and called on federal agencies to, quote, ban the box, referring to the section on job applications that asks about criminal history. Senator Kaine's appearance today in large part grew out of a nice conversation we had in Richmond about 3 months ago where we really went in depth. I think he took a huge interest in a lot of our work and the way we did it. And I'm really delighted to have you here with us today. Senator Kaine will speak for a few minutes and has agreed to stay for a few questions, and we'll hopefully be able to hang in for a little while to hear some more of our program. Senator Kaine, thank you for coming.
Well, thank you so much, and good morning. I'm really happy to be here at Rob's invitation with Convergence. You guys are a wonderful organization, and before I get into the topic of the day and talk about getting ready for reentry and what the congressional support for Convergence's recommendations could be, I just want to say a little bit about my awareness of the organization. Again, probably the first awareness was in the work that you were doing around U.S.-Pakistan when Pakistani legislators came in to talk to a number of us, especially those on the Foreign Relations Committee. But I also began to hear about Convergence from friends of mine. I have a dear friend on the West Coast who's been a supporter who was talking to me about the work that Rob and Convergence were doing. I have a friend in Richmond who was my general counsel when I was governor, and I hired as a general counsel a trained mediator who was actually a public policy mediator. And during my 4 years as governor, I would use him to help break log jams on tough political issues that this Democratic governor was working on with 2 Republican houses. Mark Rubin, who's a friend of Rob's, was so good at what he did that legislators would often come to me and say, can we borrow Mark for 2 days? We have a dispute. The governor, you're not interested in this. It's not your issue, but we're bogged down on something. Can we borrow Mark for 2 days or 2 months to help us resolve an issue? And so the Convergence focus on, you're not mediators, but in a way you're doing the kind of public policy mediation that we were able to use successfully in Virginia to bring stakeholders together from different, representing different interests and different parties and finding the areas of common ground. And you can set aside the areas of disagreement. There's always enough common ground to make a long to-do list of things that we agree on that can move the needle. In addition, I just want to let you know, Rob, that as a member of the Budget Committee, we're right now engaged in discussions about could we fix a very broken federal budget process. The Budget Control Act of 1974 has been honored more in the breach than the observance, and it's time to look at a better way to do budgeting, and Convergence's work on that issue is very much topical right now, as on the Budget Committee, Chairman Enzi and a number of us are trying to find improvement. So the work that you do is important. You pick important issues. This is a hugely important one, and I have enjoyed reading, at least kind of at a beginning level, the recommendations that are being made, and look forward to working to advance them in Congress. The final report lays out the anomaly of a U.S. prison population that is dramatically higher per capita than other nations, the pain of a recidivism rate that, though declining, is still too high. The report sets out a theory of change that is then based on some fundamental values and principles. And then it advances strategies across a number of areas, strategies that will require political will, will require resources, and importantly, will require collaboration. In fact, Stephanie, one of the things that I thought was the most interesting about the report, and that was sort of an aha moment, yes, of course, is the focus on the silos. That we have an awful lot of good people doing an awful lot of good work, but so often the work that is being done in the reentry space is very fragmented, which makes it both less effective, but also for the standpoint of the person who wants to use these services, fragmented systems are inaccessible systems. Where do I go to really connect and get the advantage of these resources? And I think it's a good feature of the report that you focus upon silos and fragmentation and the need for integration and collaboration. The scope of the issue is massive, as you all know. 2.3 million people in custody at any point in time, 840,000 Americans on parole, 3.6 million Americans on probation, and millions more, nearly 1 in 3 of the American adult population, with a criminal record that imposes burdens in employment, burdens in voting, burdens in social stigma. Studies have suggested that just in law, there are 40+ thousand consequences of a criminal record that can be a burden on your life. And so this topic, how do we make reentry more possible and more successful and more accessible, could not be more important. I've had roundtable meetings as a senator in Virginia with people who are about to leave local jails or prisons, or people who are now out in the world fighting through the reentry process, where they've shared with me the obstacles that they face. And I think the report does a good job of taking advantage of that just direct reporting from people who are affected in making recommendations that speak to their condition. Now, much of the report is really directed at state and local policymakers. Well, I'm a senator who was a state and local policymaker. I was a mayor, and we had a very, very overpopulated city jail in Richmond, and I was a governor with a Department of Corrections, and so worked on these issues at the state level. And so I read these, and I read the state and local recommendations with real interest because of past work that I've done, but I also see a lot in this report that can serve as the basis for congressional action too. The topic of my speech is supposed to be congressional leadership around the area of reentry, but before I talk about that, let me just brag a little bit about Virginia. There's nothing we're doing in any area where we can't do a lot better. Virginia is sort of a uniquely bad state when it comes to felon reenfranchisement, because we're one of 2 states that disenfranchise all felons automatically by Constitution, subject to the governor restoring rights. I restored rights of thousands when I was governor, and the most recent governor, Governor McAuliffe, restored just historic numbers of rights, and yet we still have an automatic disenfranchisement provision in the Constitution, which we need to change. But we do have a couple of things that are going well. So we have a declining youth and adult incarceration, and we have the lowest recidivism rate in the United States. The recidivism rate of somebody released from prison who comes back in to incarceration within 3 years in Virginia, it's 23.4%, and it's been the lowest in the nation for the last 3 years. We're proud of that. We used the fiscal crisis of 2008 to 2010, when our state revenues plummeted, as a motivation to close prisons and juvenile correctional facilities. We were imprisoning too many people, and when we had the mandate, because of balanced budget requirements, to make cuts, we decided we were imprisoning too many people. Let's make cuts there. We reduced youth populations. We've dramatically reduced youth populations in juvenile detention facilities by deciding that there are better strategies to use with young people than putting them in a detention facility. And the state has implemented important programs like a workforce readiness curriculum as a mandate before somebody gets out of the DOC so that people begin to have the skills they need to more successfully reenter and have a chance in the workforce. Congressional leadership, it's about attitude, having the right attitude about the importance of reentry programs. It's about resources, and it's about political will. Political will being courage, but also the willingness to move something up the priority list. You can be supportive, but if there's always another more important priority and you never get to it, you've got to have the political will to move these issues nearer the top. And I think that we're in a positive moment right now in terms of the ability of Congress to tackle reentry issues in a way that is more bipartisan and more effective than we have in the past. I believe that based upon our experience in working on the bipartisan First Step Act. That was a first step. It wasn't everything we needed to do in criminal justice reform by a long shot, but it was very bipartisan. The vote in the Senate in December of 2018 was 87-12. And it was enthusiastically championed by the Trump administration, including members of the president's own family. Jared Kushner was directly and personally very, very involved in trying to, convince reluctant senators to get on board and clear up roadblocks. And so when you see Democrats and Republicans in Congress and the Trump administration very invested personally in getting this bill over the finish line, that tells you, okay, there is a moment in time here that we need to continue to take advantage of. First Step was the beginning of a fix for federal sentencing and incarceration policies, the beginning. It included important steps to reduce recidivism, facilitating family contact, which is so important. Better substance abuse treatment, also critical. Good time credits for people participating in educational or rehabilitation programs. And the bill also, as you know, reauthorized the Second Chance Act. First Step Act reauthorizes Second Chance Act. Some good, naming going on there. But the Second Chance Act is the federal law which funds the kind of spectrum of reentry programs that we support at the federal level. I think there are 4 kind of social and political dynamics right now that make this a good time to be focusing on these efforts at both the state and local, but also at the federal level. You can't take for granted that these 4 dynamics will be in place forever. We ought to take advantage of them while we can. Let me tell you what the 4 dynamics are that I see that lead to a First Step Act being passed by an 87-12 vote, and that can give us some space to do more good work of the kind you suggest. First, a realization of what we've done over the last couple of decades. 3 strikes and you're out, mandatory minimums, no parole, is costly and inhumane and ineffective. I think there is a realization, and not just among some, but among many, that the criminal justice policies of the past have not worked. We spend more, we incarcerate more, and we don't do it in a way that really improves people's lives. In fact, you can argue that the over-incarceration has a brutalization effect that makes matters worse. So there's a realization, and I think this is, kind of, I think it was Edison who said discontent is the first sign of progress. When you look in the mirror and you say, what we're doing isn't working, and I think a lot of us have looked in the mirror and say, what we're doing isn't working, that then opens up the space for new approaches. Second, this is going to sound like a little bit of a partisan comment, but I'm just going to be candid with you. Democrats traditionally have been on board with criminal justice reform efforts, and yet we've often struggled to find partners on the GOP side. But on the GOP side now, there is a real pro-reform constituency developing because of 2 strong components of today's GOP. First, those who worry about high taxes and excessive government spending. If you don't like high taxes and you don't like excessive government spending, and you start looking at what we spend money on, you pretty quickly get to incarceration expenses. In Virginia, I did this when I was governor. I looked at basically per capita spending in any area in Virginia in the 20 years before I was governor. And I noticed that pretty much per capita spending on virtually everything except one thing was flat to declining. And the only thing where it was increasing, and not by a little, but by a lot, was incarceration expenses. And so within the GOP, that strong anti-tax, anti-government spending constituency within the GOP, as they turn the searchlight on areas of budgeting and they see this dramatic spiking and so far out of whack with other nations, they naturally start to say, this is wasteful, we ought to be doing something better. And second, the GOP has a huge contingent of religious voters, of evangelicals who deeply believe in second chances as a core component, a core faith value. And so when you take those two components of the GOP, the sort of anti-tax, anti-spending members, and the evangelicals, religious voters who believe in second chances, that's a huge percentage of the GOP electorate. And so together with sort of Democrats who have more traditionally been supportive of criminal justice reform issues, there's now a strong GOP pro-reform component as well. And I think that explains an 87-12 vote on a sentencing reform bill. So that's the second dynamic. And I think that dynamic is not a short-term one. I think that dynamic of a GOP pro-reform constituency is likely to exist for some time, so let's take advantage of it. Here's a third dynamic, the low unemployment rate. The low unemployment rate. When you're dealing with the employment needs of ex-offenders, and they've got a record that makes people look at them with some skepticism, and we still have too much social stigma around a criminal record, the employment challenges are so difficult. But when the unemployment rate goes lower and lower and lower, employers start to get more and more creative. And employers, in my anecdotal experience in Virginia, are now much more open to considering people with criminal records because of low unemployment. I'm just going to tell you a quick story. This is a fascinating one. Southwest Virginia, Appalachia. There's a manufacturing company called Utility Manufacturing that makes the trailers for over-the-road trucks. And they have two manufacturing facilities, one in Smith County, one in Washington County, down in Appalachia. One makes the non-refrigerated trailers and one makes the refrigerated trailers. They just can't hire enough people. They do everything. I've spent time with the plant manager. They run the one ads and they go to the career fairs and they just can't hire enough people. And so this plant manager started to think, well, I can't hire enough people. What do I do? And he hit upon this genius idea. I'm going to go to the local drug court. Everybody here familiar with drug courts? People who are arrested on drug offenses, if they have sort of a promising path, they instead of getting convicted and sentenced, they get diverted into a drug court program where over the course of, could be a year or 2 years, random drug testing, intense wraparound services, you need to find a job. And then if they do those things for 2 years, then the charges are dismissed and they don't end up burdening their record. I've been to many a drug court graduation in Virginia. They're very, very powerful programs. Well, this local plant manager went to the drug court and said, I know you've got people in the drug court program, and I know part of what they need to do is find jobs. Give me your best 5 and I'm going to hire them. Now, this was a genius move because this plant manager knew the judge would think, if I send them 5 and they all work out, then they'll hire another 5. They'll hire 10. If I send 5 and it doesn't work out, he won't come back. So the drug court staff was really motivated to send great people. And the plant manager also knew, I don't have to babysit these folks. They're already getting random drug screened for the drug court program. Everything, they have wraparound social services. I don't have to provide those. That's part. And these people are very motivated to successfully complete the program. This hiring of the drug court attendees has now mushroomed into a common thing that this employer and other employers are doing in Southwest Virginia. But they wouldn't have even gone down the path had it been easy to fill the jobs that they have. And so in a moment where the unemployment rate is low, this is the thing that can change. This is the one dynamic where we have to take advantage of it right now while the unemployment rate is low. Hard to employ populations, could be vets, could be military spouses, could be people with disabilities, could be people with criminal records. The time to make headway on advancing and clearing obstacles to employment is when the unemployment rate is low. So that's a dynamic right now that I think is a fertile opportunity for those of us who want to succeed in reentry programs, especially around the employment side. The last dynamic is changing social attitudes about substance abuse. Thankfully, changing social attitudes. Now, I'm going to make a statement that there's some real pain connected with this statement that I'm about to make. And yet, while there's pain connected to it, there's also an opportunity that we have to take advantage of. When substance abuse issues were inner city issues, crack or whatever, it was lock them up, throw away the key, mandatory minimums, 3 strikes and you're out, public safety, the hard hammer, when it was an inner city issue. The opioid issue has gone way beyond the inner city. It's suburbs, it's rural, it's white, it's black, it's every population, it's young, it's seniors. And so once this substance abuse issue has spread out from just oppressed or minority populations, suddenly, oh, gosh, we got to be sympathetic. We have to have a public health approach to this problem. Now, it's painful that generations of those caught in substance abuse were treated as expendables that we could lock up. And now that the problem is more widespread, oh gosh, we have to be compassionate and have a public health attitude. We should have had the compassionate public health attitude 25 years ago. And yet, though it is painful to acknowledge that reality, thank God we're starting to look with a different eye about substance abuse issues. We're starting to look with a different eye. The opioid crisis is unlike any crisis I've ever seen. I'm really a data guy. If you look at pretty much any measure that would be a measure of a troubling outcome, states 1 to 50, low birth weight babies, states 1 to 50, youth smoking, states 1 to 50, you tell me a bad outcome. You put that list of states up there, the best states will be high income states and the worst states will be low income states. So many of the difficult outcomes, they just track directly with poverty. But if you look at a list 1 to 50, overdose deaths, it's going to be unlike any list you will ever see. Because in the top 10, the best 10 states, there will be rich states and poor states. And in the worst 10 states, there will be rich states and poor states. It is the opioid overdose phenomenon has completely scrambled the normal way that, we kind of rank states, and it affects rich, poor, suburban, urban, rural, young, old, white, black, Asian American, Hispanic American, Indian American. It affects everybody. That is opening up a window to look at it more as the public health issue that it is. So those 4 dynamics, a different and maybe, thank God finally, more reasonable understanding of substance abuse issues, a low unemployment rate, a GOP constituency that's pro-criminal justice reform that's growing, and a realization that what we've been doing hasn't worked. I do think that opens up a moment, Rob, where there's the biblical parable about whether the seeds fall on rocky ground, fertile ground, or ground where there's a lot of thorns that choke them off. This is a moment where the seeds of the report can fall on fertile ground because of those 4 dynamics. But before I conclude, I will say one thing. The one dynamic of the 4 I mentioned, low unemployment, it's not going to last forever. So it's pretty important that we try to push right now when we have a low unemployment rate, because I think that offers some opportunities on the employment recommendations you make. All of the trends do open up political space, and we ought to look at the political landscape and everything we do. Give you an example. I'm on the HELP committee. We are currently working on the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, use of Pell Grants for people in prison. Perfect opportunity to dovetail in with these recommendations. There's pilot projects that are underway now on that. That's great. But let's go beyond pilot projects. And why should somebody be barred from a Pell Grant if they income qualify? We want them to get skills so recidivism drops and they have a better life. We ought to enable folks imprisoned who are taking, legit courses for which other people could get a Pell Grant. We should let them get a Pell Grant. There's going to be an opportunity on that just in the next couple of months in my committee. I'll just tell you personally what I am doing with the report is there's 2 issues that I'm the most interested in. One is obvious from what I've said, and then I'll spend a minute on the second one. The first one is this employment issue. We've done a lot of work in our office on first veterans unemployment. I'm on the Armed Services Committee. And then we started to work on military spouse unemployment. Military spouses have it 3 to 5 times higher than the national average in terms of their unemployment. And what we realized is, we're starting to kind of develop especially on employment for people who faced obstacles to jobs. So let's extend it. Let's focus on employment for folks with disabilities and employment for people with criminal records. And so we're starting to build out a portfolio in my office on this issue. So the recommendations you make on the employment side are something that we're really interested in and working with you on. And then the second one, I'm going to just come back to mental health and substance abuse. Here is another painful thing. So when I meet a sheriff in Virginia, and the Virginia system is every city and county has a jail. Sometimes they operate them as regional jails, but 100+ jails with jailers, and the supervising official of jail is usually the locally elected sheriff. So when I meet a sheriff in Virginia, I always ask him this question: what percentage of people in your jail shouldn't be there? Now, I never have to describe what I mean by that question. They know exactly what I mean by that question. I have never had a sheriff say less than 40%. My sheriffs say 40% on the low side, 70% on the high side. They know what I mean. What percentage of people are in your jail because of a mental health issue that has not been treated? Sometimes it's even been diagnosed and never treated, or a substance abuse issue that has not been treated. And the sheriffs are some of our most compassionate around this. They're like, this is exactly the kind of person that shouldn't be in jail. But if you have a society that does not invest in mental health and substance abuse services, people who suffer from those maladies, there's going to come a day when they may do something that will be a violation of public order or dangerous to themselves or dangerous to somebody else. And because society hasn't caught it at the front end with services, then you have them in jail. A, they shouldn't be in jail. B, it's really unfair to ask of our law enforcement, oh, well, we're not going to fund mental health, but you just have to be kind of the backstop for a society that is unwilling to fund mental health and substance abuse services. So what we do on the prevention side will keep a lot of people out of being incarcerated. What we do while people are incarcerated should help them try to lick the problems that they have so that they can be more successful when they reenter. I visited within the last year a really powerful substance abuse peer program in the Chesterfield County Jail. It's a recovery home model program that the sheriff there just created with no money, and he wasn't an expert at this at all, but he just saw too many people dying of ODs in his county, people who had been in his jail or who had had family members in his jail, and he said, I better start a program to try to deal with this in my jail. And so I visited with about 60 men on one side of the jail and about 60 women on the other side of the jail. And on both sides, when I opened it up for questions, I got asked this question: hey, Senator, how come I had to get arrested to get a program like this? Now, Richmond's a metro area of 1 million people, so it's not like we're a community that doesn't have resources. But for as big as we are, and we're a state capital too, there were not good substance abuse prevention programs, at least none that these folks were aware of. And they felt like, okay, now that I'm in jail, I'm getting a good program, but when I get out, I'm going to have something on my record that's also going to make my life harder. So I think that the recommendations to really advance the reentry cause, I think we have to continue to really grapple with both the mental health and substance abuse issues, and we have to realize that we can't expect our prisons and jails to be the backstop when society's unwilling to invest in those services on the front end. So anyway, I appreciate the chance to come, and I'm going to go mark up my bill to raise the federal tobacco age from 18 to 21 in a few minutes, but I'm going to take I'm glad to take up a couple of questions, or actually even more than questions. I'd love your suggestions. So I'll open it up, Rob, and take a few.
Sure. Are there any questions for Senator Kaine as you mull through these very, very deep, substantive comments? Please.
And please introduce yourself, too.
Good morning, Senator.
Good morning.
Louis L. Reed with Cut 50. I just want to applaud your leadership on the First Step Act as an individual who not only served nearly 14 years in federal prison, but was very intricately involved with the forward momentum on the First Step Act. I know that I'm hearing from people who are incarcerated, families of those individuals who are incarcerated, who will be returning back to our communities. And while they are very excited, obviously, to be released, they're still presenting challenges for people who are returning back to our communities as it relates to reentry resources, housing, employment, et cetera. So I just wanted to, acknowledge your leadership on the First Step Act. Number one, that deserves a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.
And also willing to extend our willingness at Cut 50, which is co-founded by Van Jones and led by Jessica Jackson, extend our willingness to continue to sit at the table with you to further advance resources that can be deployed in our 94 judicial districts across our nation so that we can give the individuals returning back to our community a fighting chance.
Excellent. And Cut 50, I think I know what the Cut 50 responds to, but is it to cut our prison population by 50%?
Not just cut our prison population by 50%, but also to reduce crime in our nation by 50%.
Excellent.
And we have a very ambitious goal to do that within the next 10 years.
That is the kind of goal that we need, and I hope a number of the presidential candidates will embrace the goal. Sometimes we talk about policies or programs, and we don't talk enough about goals. And what I like about Cut 50 is this is a goal, and we can achieve this. Our incarceration rate is so much worse than other nations, not because our people are worse, it's because our policies are worse. Our people aren't worse, our policies are worse. And so setting a goal like that and then having meaningful strategies, and then you can measure every year against the goal. We're not making the progress we need to, or we've really done some good things. I so applaud that effort to set the goal out there and then hold ourselves accountable for moving toward it. So thank you for that. Yeah, please, right here.
So I'm Ashley McSwain.
Hey,
I'm
Ashley.
the Executive Director for Community Family Life Services.
Excellent.
Can you share with me your thoughts around how do we address the needs of women, or do you believe that there are any differentiations between the needs of women and the way the criminal justice system is designed and structured?
Boy, what a great question. And I will say this, it's just you asking the question wants me to, sit down and talk to you more and get your insight on this. A couple of things I've noticed, anecdotal. So when I was at the Chesterfield Jail, I was just describing this, and I was sitting with the peer recovery programs on the men's side and on the women's side. Was something that was very obvious to me as people were telling their stories. On the men's side, the most common story tended to be sports injury, auto accident, prescribed an opioid, kind of spiraled downward into an addiction. On the women's side, the origin story was trauma, domestic abuse, poverty and homelessness. And so I thought it was really interesting, this is just the Rorschach of what people are saying about their own stories, that the men's side was sort of one kind of origin to why I'm now here with an addiction problem. And the women's side was a different origin, and it was trauma. And so that makes me think, as we're talking about mental health issues, it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. We have a huge shortage of mental health professionals. One of the things we ought to be doing in the Higher Education Act rewrite is, incentives through public service loan forgiveness and things like that to really beef up the cadre of mental health professionals we have in the country. But it's not one size fits all. So I think that the experience of women who are in prison, to the extent that that's tied into trauma issues, it's going to require, a different focus, because reentering, if you've not had the kind of wraparound service you need to deal with trauma issues, and if they're still, in your heart and in your soul, you can run but you can't hide. You're still going to be dealing with trauma issues. So I think that there's probably 50 other ways to answer that question, but that's my Rorschach answer when you asked are there differences. It's just that observation. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, please.
Hi.
Two more questions.
Maria Schiff with the Pew Charitable Trusts. Could you comment on whether you see anything that the federal government could do to increase effective treatment of substance use disorder in the jails and the prisons, including the federal prison, but specifically jails?
I think it's a huge open field. Here is a weakness. This is a weakness to Congress. Sometimes we let the committee jurisdictions, the committee jurisdictions become too siloed sometimes. So, criminal justice reform, that should be for a judiciary committee. Well, I'm not on the judiciary committee, so, the judiciary committee will figure it out. This is a health issue. Why shouldn't the health committee, why shouldn't we be dealing with mental health issues in prisons and mental health training for police officers and first responders? Oh, that's a judiciary committee issue, because if it's about first responders, that's like cops grant, that's judiciary. No, it's a health issue. So sometimes we use we don't really intentionally use, but we kind of fall into a pattern of, that issue, that's for judiciary. These are health issues. And one of the things that I've sort of just pledged to myself just in the last few months is I sort of had this realization about the way the committee jurisdictions become silos, is to try to use the position that I now have on HELP, which is the newest of the committees I'm on. I've been on now for 2 years. I would really like to start digging into some of the issues that have just been pushed over into judiciary, but come at them from the health side. Now, we've done some work. We've done 2 opioid-related Comprehensive Addiction Recovery Act bills in 2015 and last year that include workforce training and then include some provisions that could be good for additional substance abuse and mental health service provision within prisons and jails. We haven't yet done much on the workforce side. I do think workforce training, let me just give you an example. Flashpoint incidents between police and community members that then lead to real tough tensions in communities. It's often, and it often exposes a racial tension between a police force and a minority community that doesn't feel served. Many of the instances that are flashpoint instances, there's a mental health issue. And the responding officer didn't have mental health training, thought it was one thing and it was something else. We just we have a fairly good track record in the city of Richmond of good community police relations, but we had a really sad killing of a citizen in the last few months by a police officer that was a mental health issue. This was an individual who was a teacher, so he was a very functioning person when he was being treated, but stopped taking medicines, there was other things going on, and so kind of was having a real psychotic incident and ended up being shot and killed by a police officer, and it created a lot of community tensions, as you might expect, but it was a mental health issue at base, but we're not giving our first responders the treatment that they need, the training that they need to recognize that. So I think that it's about provision of services to individuals, but it's also making sure that our first responders are really educated on mental health issues, because that can also de-escalate instances that often become flashpoints for a lot of community division. So I do think that there's going to be an opportunity for us to take it out of law enforcement, judiciary, and start thinking more broadly about these issues, even in prisons and jails, as public health issues.
One last question. We have one right up front here. It's one of our speakers today.
Great.
Hi,
Hi.
my name is Helena Bragg. I'm on the Speakers Bureau, alumni of Friends of Guest House. So
What a great program. Oh my gosh. Friends of Guest House?
So we got pictures together.
Yeah.
But anyway,
Please visit this program in Alexandria. If you haven't, you will fall in love with it.
My question is this. There's a rumor going around in Virginia that as of July 1st, returning citizens with outstanding fines and court costs will be allowed to receive their driver's permit. Is that true?
That is true.
Thank
So let me explain this one. Talk about an obstacle. So convicted, you got court costs and fines. Until you pay them off, you can't get a driver's license. Okay, well, how are you going to pay them off? Well, you better get a job. Well, wait a minute. How can I get a job if I don't have a driver's license? I mean, driver's license and employment are really connected. There's about 750,000 Virginians out of a population of 8.5 million. That's a big number. That's 10% of the population who have lost their ability to have a driver's license because of unpaid court costs and fines. I got to give Governor Northam some praise on this. A bill got put on his desk that didn't do that. It did something else about driver's licenses, but he used a power that the governor has to amend it and say, no, we're going to give people their driver's license back. Then he sends it back down, and the two houses of the legislature voted to accept his amendment. So yes, beginning on July 1, I don't know all the details about the application process, et cetera, but nearly 1/10 of our population has lost driver's license because of criminal convictions and unpaid court costs and fines, and that will no longer be the penalty for unpaid court costs and fines. And that's, talk about clearing an obstacle to reentry. Really, really good news at the state level. Thanks for asking that. Hey, thanks. Great to be with you guys today. Thanks, Rob. Yeah, I'm really glad you
So I just want to quickly thank Senator Kaine for such rich, substantive, deeply knowledgeable remarks. I really appreciate given the time. He does have to get back for a markup. So thank you for being with us again, and we'll be in touch. And Senator Kaine, I also wanted to mention we are in conversations with Senator Enzi's staff on budget process, so good for that. We have two great panels coming up. I'm going to turn it back to Stephanie and move into it. I hope everyone will stay to listen to these wonderful presentations we now have.